Will you pray with me? Create in us clean hearts, O God. In the silence, may we hear your small voice. Fill us with the assurance of your presence in everything that we do. Be with me as I preach and all of us as we listen for the words of the gospel this morning. Amen. Human beings are offended by suffering. We don't like it. Whenever we see suffering in the world, we have to find out the reason for it. There is always a why hovering in the background where there is pain. As someone who ministers to the homeless, I am in inches away from suffering at all times. I see suffering on a weekly basis that is at the extremes of what is allowed to exist in our society for individual pain. But in the traditional church, Pastor Robin will tell you, I would tell you that whenever we go visit somebody who is sick or somebody who has lost a loved one, somebody who's endured a financial loss or the loss of a job or the death of a pet, there's always questions of why. What did I do to deserve this, people will say. Why would God allow this to happen to me? What did I do that God would test me like this? Those are the questions of why that we hear. In those moments, it's not time for us to provide like a theological correction. In that moment, it's only up to us to provide a calming presence. But with the why, there is also an answer, an incorrect answer that we provide when we see suffering in other people. If something bad happens to someone who has hurt us, what do we say? They had it coming. How often do we hear that? During the AIDS crisis, there was a slowness in response because it was the perception of people of faith and people in government that those who were suffering were people who had sinned, and this was punishment for their indiscretions. Looking back, the hundreds of thousands of people who died because of our slowness to respond, because of the perception, the incorrect perception that their suffering was earned. During COVID, how often have we heard when we hear that someone has contracted the disease, people will say, were they being careful? Did they wear their mask? Did they follow the rules? They shouldn't have gone here. They shouldn't have done this. They shouldn't have taken off this piece of protective gear. We have to give a reason. It's the person's fault that they got sick. We have to place that blame on someone. Once again, in homelessness ministry, we are one of the only countries in the world that treats homelessness like a moral failing. Other countries have found ways to treat homelessness as a public health crisis, not one that's rooted in blame. But our very tradition of holiness and religiosity in the United States causes us to place blame on people who suffer. It's their fault for being addicted. It's their fault for getting fired from their job. It's their fault for not having the same social net of security that I have. And there's an unwillingness to recognize that it could happen to us. There is a fear that if we allow for the existence of suffering on other people, we have to recognize that that same suffering could happen to us. And the lesson that I give children or youth whenever they visit Worcester Fellowship or any outdoor church that I'm present at is that none of us are more than 5 bad days away from ending up on the street. No matter your age, no matter your socioeconomic status, no matter your health status, no matter the state of your mental health, no matter the level of your sobriety, there's no one that's more than 5 bad days away from ending up on the street. Usually it's 5 catastrophes that happen in a short amount of time that lead someone to be on the street. And once they get to that level, because of the barriers that we have created through policies that are built on the assumption that someone who's homeless is there because of their sins. It's almost impossible for someone to get off the streets once they get on. It's almost impossible for someone to get clean once they become addicted. It's almost impossible for someone to rejoin society once a mental illness has caused such devastation that they're on the streets. Preachers have made whole careers around the idea that if you just pray right and just believe correctly or attend the right church, if you watch the right sermon on the television or listen to the right podcast, that you will be healthy, wealthy, and wise, that prosperity is available to you if you but believe. But I think everybody in this room knows that those promises ring false because we see that bad things happen to good people. The prosperity gospel falls empty on the ears of people who have experienced suffering. Because the promise of prosperity also comes with the problem of prosperity, where we see that people who do great evils become wealthier and wealthier, while the people who are the most poor, the people that we believe that God cares for deeply, suffer the most. And that leads us to a seemingly paradoxical tension that people of faith have to hold in a nuanced, sophisticated way. We have to hold two ideas that might seem contradictory in our mind at the same time. Suffering is a part of human experience, but suffering is not punishment from God. A belief that punishment brings pain, or that suffering is the result of God's dissatisfaction with us, is deeply encoded even in our language. The word pain comes from the Latin word poeia, which means punishment. In English, this is translated in kind of old-timey movies or books about, castles and knights, but you might hear, "Do not enter on pain of death." Pain is punishment in the English language. It's encoded in how we talk. Suffering is also used in the sense of allowance. So you might hear, "I do not suffer fools." I will often say that to my children. "I do not suffer disrespect in my house." Suffering means allowance. So within our English language, we insinuate that if someone is in pain, it's because they have done something to deserve the pain. And that if someone is suffering, it's because God has allowed that suffering to exist. In seminary and in undergraduate, I studied a kind of a niche theological study. It was something that I think everyone grapples with, but a lot of people don't study specifically in seminary or write their thesis on it like I did. And that's theodicy. Not the Odyssey written by Homer, theodicy, which comes from two Greek words, theos and dike. Theos meaning God, dike meaning justice. And so theodicy is a defense of God's justice in the face of suffering. If God is good and God is all-powerful, why does God allow evil to exist? Why does God suffer evil? After years of reading and study, I didn't find an answer that was sufficient or to me seemed intellectually honest. But instead of asking the question, why do bad things happen? I found a stream within theodicy that says, instead of trying to answer why, the correct answer should be what now? When we are faced with the fact of evil or the fact of suffering or pain, the question for us as Christians is not to ask why. The question is to say, what now? What should our response be to the inevitability of suffering that we answer in the world? I'm not here to give you an answer for why it's allowed to exist, but I am here to tell you that it does exist and that God does not cause it. And the question, rather than worrying ourselves with coming at an equation to answer this impossible question, we should ask ourselves, what now? When we see that our community is in need of food, we say, what now? And we create food as love. When we see that our families are in need of support with their children during their online learning, we say, "What now?" And we create the remote learning center. We don't wallow in the question of why. We say, "What next?" I usually preach off my iPad, and I keep trying to scroll up my pad of paper. It's a little bit of a distraction. If you see me keep doing it, just ignore it. I keep being like, "Come on." All right. This question of what now or what next, I think should be rooted in the person of Jesus. We can look and see how Jesus responded to suffering, pain, or brokenness. Whenever someone came to Jesus with a problem, he did not say, "You have this problem because of your sin." Instead, he healed them. When someone came to Jesus, when the crowds came to Jesus with hunger, he didn't say, "Why didn't you prepare?" Instead, he said to his disciples, "You feed them." When presented with someone who was born blind, his disciples asked him, "Who sinned that this man would be born blind, him or his parents?" And Jesus said, "Neither sinned. But this person was born blind and now see the glory of God." When Jesus is met with the fact of human suffering, he does not ever turn people away. He heals. He doesn't punish people with pain, but instead he hangs from the cross and asks God to forgive his murderers. We attribute to God something that Jesus himself does not do. Jesus does not curse, Jesus heals. Jesus doesn't curse, Jesus comforts. And we know that Jesus understood all human suffering because Jesus himself was human. God, through the person of Jesus, understands what it means to feel pain. Jesus understood, and therefore God understands what it means to suffer. In the often preached from favorite verse of Matthew 25, where Jesus says, when I was hungry, you came to me and gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I didn't have clothing, you clothed me. When I was sick and in prison, you visited me. It's often presented as something that Jesus is talking about the things that we should do to other people, and that's true. The least of these are those whom we should have our primary concern. But Jesus also experienced each of those sufferings in his own body. He fasted for 40 days in the desert. He experienced hunger. The Greek word for hunger is lost there. It's really, he was famished unto death. As he hung from the cross, he said, "I thirst." He was forced to hang naked during the time of his trial. He was imprisoned and cold. He was sick unto death. Jesus understands our pain because Jesus himself experienced it. This is the first week, the first Sunday of Lent. Lent is a time when we explore spiritual disciplines and we recommit ourselves to the practice of disciplines. Oftentimes people make a false connection between the word discipline and disciple. They sound the same, but in language studies we would call this a false cognate. Something that sounds like it's rooted in the same word, but it's not. Discipline is not rooted in disciple, which is to follow. Discipline is rooted in to experience discomfort or pain. Think about it. If you take on a discipline of exercising, does it feel good? No. When you take on a discipline of cutting back on sweet foods that aren't good for you, does that feel very good? Jared has quit drinking coffee. Jared, did it feel very good the first few weeks that you tried to quit? No, it does not. Disciplines in the Christian church are what we might call a means of grace, a way for us to willfully put ourselves in a position to receive the grace that's already available to us. Disciplines are like dipping our hand into a well. The well was not made by us, but we still have to dip our hands into it to receive the healing waters. Disciplines like prayer, meditation, fasting, simplicity, study, charity, confession, solitude, and silence All of these disciplines are a moment, an opportunity for us to take on a willful discomfort in a world that prioritizes living without pain or living without any moments of awkwardness. Think about it. Taking on a willful discomfort in a world that says that if you are ever uncomfortable, it's because you did something wrong is radical. I've been in some form of homeless ministry now for almost 10 years. And it was now something that's the greatest joy of my life. And I yearn for the time that I get to hang out with my folks at Worcester Fellowship. I think about it all week. I'm ready to go the moment it happens. And it's never a chore for me to go and spend time with my people. But it wasn't always the case. Being a young kid in Texas, as a teenager, being brought for the first time to help a woman move from one government-subsidized housing to another, it was awkward. My body screamed for me to get out of there. I didn't know this person. Their pain offended me. I saw their pain and it made me squirm. It made me want to leave and retreat back to a place of comfort. But I stuck with it, like walking that first mile on the treadmill when you're trying to get back in shape. It was a discipline that led me to a deeper understanding of God's love for me and for the entire created world. I was able to see that person's humanity the moment I was able to push past my own desire for comfort, my own judgment for why this person was in the situation that they were in. And I began to see that they, just like me, were victims of circumstance and chance and bad luck and joy and pain and celebration. It was a mix of these things, a mix of shadow and light, a mix of good and bad, a mix of good luck and bad. Voluntary discomfort, putting yourself in a position where you are face to face with suffering, is hard, but only at the beginning. Once you channel out grooves in your own soul where the waters of discomfort have rolled through you so many times, eventually it forms a stream of healing in your own life. And it's something that finally brings you joy the way that you know that it should. Sea glass is made from something that was shattered and broken. And then over a period of time that is hard for us as human beings to even understand, the glass is pummeled by the salt and the seawater. It's thrown against the coarseness of the sand. Sand and salt are abrasive. Anybody here ever accidentally run their hands against sandpaper? Or caught yourself like in a belt sander, cut your knuckle off? It can be painful sand. Sandpaper, you rub against something that you want to polish until you scrape away all the imperfections of the surface until what's left is smooth and beautiful, sought after and treasured. The irony of ironies is that when you rub yourself against something that is rough, it becomes smooth. My challenge for us during this time of Lent, when all of us have already endured so much loss and discomfort and pain, when so many of us have seen death firsthand, perhaps instead of giving something up for Lent the way that you might normally do, as is customary in this part of the world, maybe what you can do this Lent is recommit yourself to disciplines. Find a time during the day that you'll set apart to pray. Find a time during the day that you'll set apart some time to read the scriptures or a commentary on the scriptures or poetry that speaks to your soul. Take the time to go out and appreciate the beauty of nature, to remind ourselves that spring will soon be here, even though now the cold is bitter. I invite you to ask yourself, how can I live more simply? How can I give more charitably? How can I put myself in a position where I find myself uncomfortable because I'm meeting someone new or I'm facing down someone suffering firsthand. I invite you to run towards the thing that scares us deeply, and that is the suffering of other people. To open up your hands in charity, to unclench your fists around the things that you hold as your own. To open up your hearts to the brokenhearted. To not look away when you see human pain, but to ask yourself, what can I do to help? When you find yourself asking, why is this person in the position that they're in? What did they do to deserve this? Instead say, I recognize the suffering. What now will I do? You are a treasure to God. Your brokenness, your pain is not something to be ashamed of, because your brokenness and your pain act as an abrasive in your life that has polished you into the treasured thing that you are. And the ability to be there as a companion to those who suffer also acts as an abrasive in our lives. If we can endure the discomfort, if we can push ourselves past the question of why and into the answer of what now, then we might be polished in the same way as the sea glass that you're holding in your hand right now. That is my challenge to you in this time of Lent. Not to crawl upon your knees or to say that you are no longer good enough, or that you need to whip yourself, or that you need to be punished for the things that you've done wrong, but to voluntarily take on the discomfort that comes with discipline so that you can more fully understand the treasure that you are and the treasure that those who suffer are to God. Amen.